Well, thanks for that. And it's nice to see a couple of familiar names and faces. For those of you who don't already know me, I'm the Director of Plant Science for the California Native Plant Society, and I have a fairly long background, a little over 20 years, with mostly with land management. And so the gardening side of things is a little bit new to me, but I'm really pleased to be here speaking with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of climate and hydrologic history and projections, which we were actually chatting about before this meeting got started. Some of the current delineations that are used in sort of the zoning of plants, and then I'll introduce the ecoregional approach, talk about our habitat revolution, our project at the California Native Plant Society, as well as delve in a little bit into the local lists. I curtailed that a little bit because I want to make sure that you all have the tools, Calscape.org and some of the other tools and campaigns, and have that knowledge so that you can explore this information a little more deeply for yourself. And if we do have time at the end with questions and everything, we can certainly go back into the lists and kind of dig more deeply. But as most of you know, the temperature's increasing and it's projected to keep increasing. We may get the same amount of rainfall in total, but what we're seeing is this wet season compressing. So we're getting a lot of rain in really short periods of time, and water shortages are projected to escalate for a few reasons. Another interesting thing is that our shoulder seasons are warming faster, and the shoulder seasons are spring and fall. So our winters are warming a little bit, our summers are warming a little bit more, but our fall and our spring are becoming a lot more like summer. So again, that's really compressing our rain. The other thing that's happening precipitation-wise is that our fog is decreasing, particularly inland, and this mostly affects a little bit up to the north, but also folks in Marin who are somewhat dependent on a little bit of the fog. So less water. And the combination of increased heat essentially means that plants will experience drought more. So even if we get the same amount of rain, they're transpiring because it's hotter. And even if the plants don't need it, the increased high degree days mean that people will water more. So regardless of the actual irrigation needs, you're sweating, you want to get your garden wet, and that's just like the way that we think. The compressed rainy season means less snowpack, which means storage shortage. That's not an issue for folks in Marin because all of our water is local. But it's also something to think about kind of on a statewide issue. And then the loss of fog, that's an additional increased summer demand in Bayside cities. And so obviously you can take me out of the water district, but you can't take the water district out of me. And so I'm still thinking about water demand and the way that people use water, because it is, it's not only water as a resource, but water is very expensive electricity wise to move around. So it all is connected. And well-designed landscaping of yards and parkways and green infrastructure can help with flood risk reduction, which is another issue if we're getting all of our rain in really, really compressed periods of time. The slow it, spread it, and sink it way of thinking of gardening and bioswales and things like that, capturing that rainwater and getting it underground as opposed to having it run off into sewers and bays and things like that. So native gardens are great at efficiency. So a study from Santa Monica showed that native gardens used 83% less water, they produced 56% less green waste, and they required 68% less maintenance. So if they're properly planned and well cared for, you can achieve a lot of savings with a native garden. And so WUCOLS, the water use classification of landscape species, has most commonly been used to partition the state into 6 regions. There are subregions within that, but mostly those 6 regions are what get pointed to. All of Marin is in the north central region, and there are 5 evapotranspiration zones within that. And that's meant to determine the irrigation needs of plantings. But I as a vegetation ecologist, like to think about, what if your plants were so adapted to this local climate that they really didn't need much, if any, irrigation. And this is a photo I took a couple years ago of purple needlegrass, which is our state grass. And it's still green in the middle of summer at the top of a south-facing slope in Marin. So this is up on Water District lands. And it would look even better if it had a little bit of irrigation. But this is essentially with no irrigation. It's still green in the middle of summer. So the way that I want to look at gardening is essentially through this ecoregional approach and looking at the Jepson subregions, which are based on the climate and the local soils and the local, I forget the word that I'm looking for, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. Marin is in the center west region, which again is kind of akin to that larger region in Luke Holes. And the coastal and bayside is that Central Coast subregion, and inland is that San Francisco Bay Area subregion. The plant communities, as you know, they shift a lot along both coastal to inland and north to south gradients. So if you think about, Mill Valley and Tiburon versus San Rafael versus Novato, and all of those are in Marin, but they're for fairly different climates. And this ecoregional approach adapts locally common plant communities and species to these landscaping recommendations. So my yard, I live in the East Bay, and I have a meadow with California poppy and purple needlegrass and California brome, valley gum plant. It's got a lot of other species as well, but a lot of locally common, drought tolerant, and long blooming plants. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important. But I want to think about gardening from this sort of approach like the Japanese garden. And that's thought of as a very formal garden, but it's meant to evoke the natural landscape in a small scale, and it's very controlled and planned. It's meant to bring nature in that miniature into your home or into your yard. And the ecoregional garden is meant to do something similar. It's meant to evoke that natural landscape with small scale habitats that is controlled and planned, and you're bringing nature in miniature to the home to support nature. So we're in a biodiversity crisis right now. Insect populations are collapsing. Birds are facing a very difficult time, a lot of wildlife as well. And what we can do at the local scale is to set up our yards to help support the food web. So previously, our criteria for choosing landscape plants were mostly for their decorative value, a little bit for their water use, but mostly for how they looked. And we can still have beautiful gardens if we use native plants in a very directed way, but we can also look at what's their value to the watershed, what's their value to pollinators, to other wildlife, carbon sequestration, building healthy soils, and also to the overall food web. And native plants do support wildlife. And so that's something that's very important for people, especially now that a lot of us are stuck at home. We're noticing actually how much wildlife really does use the native plants in our yard. I'm lucky enough to have an oak tree in my backyard, and I do see just the sheer number of birds that are living in that oak tree and using it for food. Another thing that locally native plants will do is to reduce harmful runoff. So they're adapted to those local conditions. You don't need to use pesticides or fertilizers or as much water. So there's less of a chance of runoff into local waterways, local storm systems. I'm going to take a quick drink here because I'm talking a lot and relatively quickly. So some of the things that I'm looking for when I'm making a local list are these necessary qualities. And there is that sweet spot in this Venn diagram of something that grows easily with minimal resources, of having high habitat value, and of something that won't harm wild populations. So in looking at plants that grow well in a landscape setting and are locally common both in nurseries and the wild, that's something that has a low barrier to adoption by the public. Something that uses minimal water is naturally drought tolerant. And as was shown recently in the Q State of the World's Plants, plants with natural drought tolerance are able to adapt better in an uncertain climate future. So they have that ability built in to be able to adapt to these shifts, given that California has seen a lot of drought in its history. A lot of these plants do have that adaptive ability within their genetic code. Something else that we have to think of more and more are pathogens. And some of these plants that they can be vectors for diseases or they suffer themselves from pathogens, Phytophthora ramorum, which is sudden oak death, the causal agent for sudden oak death, and also some other Phytophthora that are coming in on native plants. There's been a lot of work in the native plant industry to address growing best management practices, but something else that we need to think about, or that I need to think about so that you don't have to think about it, is recommending plants that will not have the opportunity to spread disease out into wildlands like what happened with sudden oak death. The other thing that I want to look at is, as a collective list, that these are providing floral resources to pollinators and to wildlife throughout the growing season. So you have plants that are starting to bloom right now. The manzanitas are well-known early bloomers, and then you have plants that are blooming all the way through the season into the fall. So some of the tarweeds are really great late bloomers. Some of the poppies, goldenrods, and a lot of the aster family are late bloomers, and that's really great, particularly for wild bee populations. Helps them to get to that last little bit of energy before they go underground. And the other thing to think about is that they're not likely to intermix with area rare plant populations. So what we want is to not affect the genetics negatively of really small plant populations, and that's why generally we're choosing relatively common plants for these yards. And it's been shown that even relatively small yards can provide pretty big pollinator benefits. So some people do kind of reject the entire idea of lists, but although I do find them kind of limiting, I try to think of gardening kind of like cooking or like putting together a puzzle. So when you're cooking, there are questions like what ingredients go together, and that's something about plant selection. What plants go together? How many portions are you going to be cooking? Like, how big is your yard? What do you already have on hand? So what are the aspects, either your soil type, your slope and aspect, the insulation, the foundation plants that you're keeping. So what are you going to build around? And then do you want local ingredients? So is it important to you to have plants that are going to be supporting local wildlife species? And that, the other question to ask is, what is your skill level? Maybe you don't want to, build your own garden. Maybe you just want to order out and have somebody come in and put in a garden for you. Maybe you want a meal kit where you select from this list and it tells you what to put where. So a landscape plan, like I'll go through the Cowscape garden planner in a little bit. Or maybe you just want to follow a recipe. So you take this list and you pick what you want off of it. Maybe you're a good cook or a master chef and you want to engage with the information yourself and make up your own recipe for your yard. So the other reasons that I like lists is that it gives people the opportunity to sort of trust an organization to do that background research for them. And I take that fairly seriously when I'm putting together these lists. And they may not want to engage more deeply with databases or other info. They just want to know, I want to support pollinators, what should I plant? And they don't want to think about these larger concepts. Or maybe they do want to think about these larger concepts and we can introduce them to those concepts through lists. So the foundation of the work that we're doing is in a couple of major databases. So Calscape is the CMPS database that relies mostly on specimen data and climate compatibility to make recommendations. So if a plant can grow in an area, so these kind of regional zones, can it grow in the San Francisco Bay Area? Then it'll get recommended to you. Calflora.org, the What Grows Here tool, allows me to explore what wild plants are common in the area. And I can put those two lists together to refine them. So you can compare these two lists to see what species are overlapping. So what are the common species that are able to grow well in this area? I can also use pests and pathogens to look at potentially problematic plants. So what plants might be a vector for a disease or susceptible to a relatively common disease. And then knowing about species biology lets me refine on some of the fire-related characteristics. So there are a lot of people who have lists out now for what plants are fire safe. And I've talked about that with the master gardeners in the past. And a lot of it has to do more with the care that you give for a plant. But in looking at recommending a plant, I want to look at a plant that without regular maintenance will still be relatively non-flammable. So plants that don't need a lot of water, plants that don't produce a lot of thatch, plants that don't need that pruning of the dead wood to stay fire safe, because I am a deeply lazy gardener and I like to support that in other people. So I want people to be safe with their plants without having to do a lot of work. And then understanding the local ecology and the local plant communities lets me kind of group based on vegetation type. And so knowing, okay, I want to recreate an oak woodland, I want to recreate a coastal prairie in these areas, and then having the great natural spaces that you do in Marin, you can see kind of the analogs to what you might want to bring into your yard. There are some plants that, I may put on a list, even though I have some questions about it, and just put it on there with that caution. Purple needlegrass, yarrow, and California poppy are pretty broadly useful across the state. And buckeye and ceanothus are ones that are good for pollinators, but can be finicky. And I know people are worried that buckeye is poisonous to honeybees, but honeybees are not a native pollinator. They've actually been shown to kind of take resources away from some of the wild bees. So, and buckeye pollen is only essentially poisonous in large amounts to honeybees. So I'm okay with recommending them with some reservations. Coast live oak and toyon are both excellent wildlife supporters, but they're prone to pathogens. And so I recommend them with some hesitation. I've found that I don't need to recommend coast live oak to get it to grow places, because the squirrels and the birds plant them all over the place. Coastal sage and coyote brush are good plants, and they're relatively easy to grow, but they do need that pruning to lower their fire risk. And so that's something else that I think about before I want to recommend that plant to somebody. And then there are plants like California sand aster and silver bush lupin and coffeeberry that have a lot of subspecies around the state. And particularly for the first two, those subspecies make a fairly big difference in the form. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see Lupinus albifrons colinus, which is the kind of the coastal low-growing version of silver bush lupin. And then on the right is variety albifrons, and that's kind of the big bushy one. And then there are a couple of other subspecies of that as well. So for the two different regions of Marin, we're looking at coastal plants. And those are representative mostly of coastal prairie, coastal scrub, and woodland. They tend to have mostly shrubs and smaller trees, vines, a lot of grasses, ground covers, perennial and annual wildflowers. There are some foundation plants like the yarrow and the poppy. There are a lot of wildlife species, great wildlife species on them, and season-long bloomers. And then inland, we'll get into more kind of the chaparral and oak woodland. But in Marin in particular, there's less of a drastic shift between the coastal and the inland, because it is, relatively speaking, a fairly similar climate in Marin. There's a lot of overlap between the coastal and inland plants. I also took a look at your native snow list and my ecoregional recommendations. There are a fair number of overlap species on that, so it's great that we're all kind of coalescing on a similar set of species. There are a few with some potential issues. So coffeeberry is one that I called out previously, where there's a fair bit of local variation, and so there's the possibility that you might get kind of the inland subspecies Tomentella versus the coastal subspecies Californica, and that might make a difference in your yard. Coffeeberry, as well as the coast live oak and the toyon I mentioned before, can be susceptible to pathogens. And then there are a couple of species on the list, California sagebrush in particular, that does need some pruning if it's going to be relatively fire resistant. But there are a lot of good wildlife supporting species, the yarrow and the coyote mint in particular. And then the California fuchsia is a really great late blooming low shrub ground cover. So the coastal prairie species, we're talking about plants in the yard. You're going to have them anchored by bunch grasses, so purple needlegrass in particular, and then some of the fescues as well. You'll get a lot of color from poppies, lupins, yarrow, checkerbloom, and clarkia. And then you can also add in additional annuals for color and then have those perennials there for the stability year after year. Adding shrubs like elderberry, I love silk tassel and blood currant as well. So silk tassel and blood currant are great early bloomers. Elderberry is a solid summer bloomer and has those great berries for the birds. Trees, we don't tend to have a lot of trees on the coast, but buckeye, toyon, and coast live oak will stand in for those woody species. Inland a little bit more of an oak forest and chaparral, anchored by kind of those blue oaks and inland live oaks. Those are less susceptible to sudden oak death. Blue oak is not susceptible to sudden oak death. Inland live oak only gets a little bit of dieback, whereas, with the coast live, you'll get whole trees dying. You do have a lot of shrub choices, which is great. Cream bush, pitcher sage, manzanita, and redberry are all really low water use and really beautiful plants. And again, you'll get color from poppies, lupins, yarrow, but switching into kind of some of the drier area, woolly sunflower and fuchsia for that extra color. And with this, you definitely need to pay more attention to spacing, placement, and ladder fuels for your fire safety. So I wanted to give you a quick rundown of cowscape.org so you can explore this information for yourself. And you can enter your address to learn what plants are native to that location. You can get detailed plant profiles and characteristics, thousands of photographs, gardening information, and nursery availability, which is something that I really value. So the specific plant you can look for, or you can enter your zip code. There's an additional advanced search function where you can enter not only your address to see helpful lists of regionally appropriate plants, but you can look at these detailed plant profiles, which has information not only about the plant and where to find it, but how to maintain it as well. I like the advanced search because I like to check different things, like maybe I want to garden for bees, maybe I'm only looking for grasses. You can put in more details about your particular yard, the sun, how much sun you have, what kind of soil you have, the drainage, your water requirements that you're looking for, if you want a particular flower color, or if you're just looking for a few nurseries in your area that have these plants. There are a lot of options with the advanced search that aren't in the main search. And if you're only interested in butterflies, then there is a page for you as well. You can see local pollinators and host plants as well. If you want to create your own plant list, you can create a Cowscape account and then have a customizable My Plants list and just add, there's a little plus sign by individual plants to add to your plant list. If you want to export that to a spreadsheet and print it out and bring it to your local nursery, you can do that too. Some of the other tools that are available are Cowscape Garden Planning Wizard, which is available at gardenplanner.cowscape.org. and will generate garden designs based on a few design preferences. So it'll ask you 4 simple questions, basically where you are, what kind of exposure you have, what you're looking for in a garden, and then it'll spit you out some answers, as well as a design like this, which is nice. So there are some for entryways, HOAs. I think there's like a little natural living where you can design a little, coffee nook in your yard or meditation space. So that's a fun tool to interact with. We also have a blog, which has a lot of helpful articles and native plant news and stories. And you can search for content if you'd like in the gardening category. We do have garden ambassadors. If you have a native yard that you're really proud of, you can join our Garden Ambassadors program and offer up virtual tools, give design ideas. There are a bunch of installation and maintenance tips, and then occasional, if you have challenges or need advice, you can reach out to other garden ambassadors. They're a really great group of folks who are interested in gardening with natives, as you are as well. Some of the work that we have done with the Southern California water districts are kind of giving people an idea of the plants in context. So some of these graphic representations with lists of plants, showing them in a garden setting, and providing this useful information in more of a stylized form. And we are looking for funding right now to do some more Northern California work. Some of the other things that we're working on, so I am working on additional ecoregional lists and getting the ones that I've developed circulated, as well as working on some delving a little deeper into kind of the fire and defensible space recommendations. So a lot of our garden designs currently don't incorporate the best practices for defensible space, and I'd like to make some modifications so that it does. We are also doing some Cowscape improvements, and we have nursery training that is available through Calscape right now. And we're offering landscaper trainings with Theodore Payne Foundation in Southern California. But both of those trainings are Southern California focused. And so we're looking to do a Northern California version of that, partly so that we can increase the availability of native plants and promote their use, but also so that we can increase the skill level of folks who are taking care of gardens in these areas. So there are a lot of folks who want people to come in and help with the landscaping, but not a lot of folks who are used to the special needs of native plants. So it's a different irrigation regime, it's a different pruning regime and all of that. So the better that we can get people working on these, the more we'll have the ability of people to have beautiful native yards. Some of the other work that we're doing is we were able to work with the California Department of Food and Agriculture on their specialty crop block grant to work on the Grow Native campaign. And this project is to help consumers learn where to buy native plants, what plants to choose, how to care for them, and then we'll be measuring it through kind of increased sales with nurseries. So we have that project going right now. It's just started, so we're not finalized on our list, but we do have some great partners, and we'll be working on kind of a marketing campaign. So hopefully you'll be seeing that soon. Some of the specialty crops that we will probably be working on are plants such as oaks, salvias, and ornamental grasses that are already listed on the list of specialty crops with CDFA. This is mostly meant for, like California almonds, California prunes. And so it's a little bit of a curveball for CDFA to be working on native plants with us, but it's really gratifying to see, and hopefully we can make some big things happen. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions and maybe getting into the lists a little bit more, but we did talk about the fact that things are getting hotter, drier, and more extreme, that the better granularity and the locally adapted plants is going to give you a better result. That if people can mimic local plant communities and provide habitat, that you'll be supporting not only kind of the beauty of your yard, but know that you're helping local biodiversity as well. So we are working pretty strongly at CMPS to balance that food web value with the decorative value and bring that new lens to native plant landscaping. Local lists have a lot of utility, I think, as a way to provide recommendations. We went really briefly over the top of these coastal and inland examples, but I did connect you with kind of ways to interact with Cowscape and other ways to dig deeper. So I want to thank you all for listening to me babble quickly about stuff that I'm interested in, and remind you that the Marin CNPS plant sale starts March 17th. So I am going to stop sharing. And I think we have a good bit of time to kind of answer questions. And if we want to pull up the lists and do a little digging around in those, then we can do that too.
Good. And we're a small enough group that I think rather than having to type your questions into the chat, if somebody just wants to raise a hand, either like this or electronically using the hand raise, you can just ask your questions directly. So, waiting to see.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Marty Marcus.
I'm thinking about putting a toy in my yard. How much of a risk is the PT for that? PR, I should say, Phytophthora. Is that a big
It's
issue?
It's not a huge issue. There are some other, I think it can host, I would have to go in and look. I want to say Pierce's disease, which is less of an issue. There have been a couple of Phytophtheras that it's been known to host, but it's relatively uncommon. And I think that the best thing to do would be to ask the nursery that you're getting it from what their Phytophthora reduction practices are. And if they don't know what you're talking about, then maybe you don't want
go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jake.
I lost a coast live oak in the windstorm a few weeks ago. It had been in declining health, so I think it was in a matter of time. And elsewhere on my property, I have a little buckeye, and I also have some volunteer oaks. And I'm wondering whether they are transplantable to the now bare spot on my hillside.
I haven't found buckeyes or oaks to be very transplantable. The oaks in particular tend to get a taproot pretty quickly. So depending on how old they are, you could give it a try. What I tend to see is that I get a lot of volunteers in my yard, just mostly from the scrub days planting acorns. So if you're not in a rush, you could try and get some acorns and put them in the spot where you want them. Or you could just try transplanting a couple of volunteers and seeing what happens.
Okay.
You might also, given the issues with sudden oak death, you might want to try, either, I don't know where you are, but either an Oregon white oak or a blue oak, because those aren't susceptible to sudden oak death.
Okay.
Good. Karen, go ahead. You need to unmute. Good, Karen, we're seeing your mouth move, but you need to unmute.
I am muted. Thank you, Andrea, for your great talk. It was very inspiring. I had a question about blue oaks because it's been my latest obsession. And you just brought them up, and I had learned that they were not susceptible to sudden oak death. But when I've seen them in the wild, I've seen them like in savannas, so grouped together. And there are some areas around my home where there's open space, and I'm wondering if that would be suitable. Yeah.
So I guess I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, if a blue oak's planted in a group, in more of like how I've seen them in sort of mass planting in the wild.
Yeah, the reason that they tend to grow en masse in the wild is that their seedlings are a little susceptible to sun damage. So they actually do well when they're shaded when they're young. So
Okay.
you could mimic that and get a blue oak that's more of a solitary tree, but they do tend to be happier together.
Okay.
So I don't know how much space you have. They are kind of I always talk about them as kind of like a Great Dane puppy. Like here's your oak tree, you know, a little oak tree that's going to be really big.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of my new neighbors who have 3 acres of land and they can't develop part of it. And I had mentioned a blue oak savanna and they got some feedback about that. And I think they have the space. It doesn't get the hard afternoon sun. It gets, till about 3 o'clock. So it might, worth a try. I just have to find a source of blue oak seedlings. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good. Tish Brown, and then after that, Stephanie. Tish also muted.
Do you have suggestions of places to go locally or quasi-locally to see good coastal prairie?
Yeah, some of the places on at Point Reyes are lovely, but they tend to be not great analogs for yards because they're so windswept. I am deeply fond of the Marin Municipal Water District lands, as well as some of the lands around the Marin Headlands. And so there are some lands on the Marin Headlands that are really nice purple needlegrass grasslands. And then there are a whole bunch of great grasslands on the Water District lands. Azalea Hill is one of those that has more of a fescue community at the bottom. And then up on a little closer to the top is more of a purple needlegrass grassland.
Can you be more specific about headlands?
Yeah, the Marin Headlands around Hawk Hill, I would say.
Okay.
Some of the valleys are a lot more kind of impacted by invasive plants. And it may, I don't know if it says on the NPS website if they have good coastal prairies. There is a report on some of the remnant chert grasslands that are up there. So you might look that up if you're really interested in where those are.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good. And Stephanie, you can, go right ahead.
So I just have used the Cowscape site before, but I haven't used the CalFlora site, and I'm sort of wondering what's the difference, or how do they compare to each other?
Yeah, so the Calscape site is driven by the herbarium specimens that have been collected near where you say you are. And the CalFlora site is herbarium specimens plus observations around a place that you designate. So, if you're asking what grows here, kind of around where I am, depending on how big of a radius you give the around where I am, it's going to depend a lot on what observations people have put in. So for somebody who's living in a city, you have to kind of zoom out quite a bit before you can get a lot of those local observations. And that's kind of a consideration. It's a lot more scale driven, whereas with Cowscape, it's not necessarily driven by observations so much as what people have collected within the 10-mile radius of where you say you are. So it's a lot of there's a lot of subtlety to it. And then just the plants that are considered to be available. So I think there's a little bit of a difference in the recommendations. It always makes me laugh in the what grows here when I check the commercially available low water use plants, and the list I get back has poison oak on it. And so it's not something great restoration plant, not something I would ever put in my yard because I'm so allergic. So CalFlora is really a database that is excellent for native plants and exploring that. And Cowscape is a great database for native plant gardening. which is a very much a kind of a subset or niche of what Calflora does.
I see. And you, in your list, I mean, you sort of talked about using these various lists together do you just sort of do that manually, or do you have tools for merging lists from different sites?
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's just an Excel, algorithm that highlights the ones that are on both lists. And then I kind of take it from there. So I can share, let's see if I can share the list so you can see. Is that it? No. All right, let me try that again. That's the one I want to share. So this is the list of plants that came together. So you can see there are all these different people recommending different plants for different regions. And if I wanted to open up, say, the coastal Alameda one and show you kind of the show you a different one here. So this one is kind of the background of that, where it's got, this is highlighted because it's on both lists. Mm-hmm. And, this one is great, but, it's not entirely recommended because it's a little hard to find. So this is kind of the background of, you get this big long list of, the Cowscape and the Calflora recommendations, and then some of them are on both lists. For this one, Grandelia camporum was on both lists, but I didn't recommend it because it's not quite what I'm looking for in a coastal plant. It's more of an inland plant. So this is the in-process sausage, if you will.
The underbelly of the beast.
Yeah. The horrible truth about how your plant lists are made.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So while you have this open, and it was fun to see that you actually took a good look at our list of 60 and you included it as you were looking at, was there some of what you should know? Because I talked to, well, Marie may want to just speak out to this herself, right? Marie, do you want to pop in? What I was going to say is, some of those were influenced by the guest speakers we had at our first meetings, because we asked them what are some plants that they would recommend, and we wanted to include those. And then my question to you was going to be, what was not on our list that you thought was a real omission? And that may have been where Marie was going, but she had her hand up, I'll let her chime in.
Oh, that's a great question, Bonnie. I was going to, I'm enjoying your presentation, Andrea. Thank you very much. I was going to mention that we are going to be publishing a new website for Marin Master Gardeners, and natives will be a natives list will be prominent on the site, as well as other lists in which native plants are heavily on there, like our habitat sections for bees and hummingbirds and so forth. We will have a list of plants that need no or very low water once established. So of course, natives are highly, there are a lot of natives on that list. So I'm just encouraging you to check back in a couple of months when we have the new list there.
That's great to know.
I'll send you the link when it goes live. Yes. So anyway, were there any glaring omissions as you looked at our list? Probably purple needlegrass. No, do we have purple needlegrass?
No,
we don't.
That is, I'm a big, I think, I'm a huge fan of native grasses. And so, any of those that I can put on the list, I'm happy to do. Stipa pulchra is such a great grass and such a workhorse that I like to see people growing it. What is another one? Blue wild rye, I think, is another really fine grass that gets overlooked a little bit. There are some really nice, deeper, like silvery blue varieties and selections that you can grow. And then Idaho fescue is another one. So yeah, the grasses would be one that I would love to see kind of a little more recommended. The California aster is another one that is, it's a really interesting plant because the two subspecies that it has are so different in their form. And kind of what I think of as the coastal variety is prostrate and makes an excellent ground cover and is a late bloomer, beautiful silvery foliage, beautiful like purple aster flowers. And the inland one is a little more leggy and upright, and it's not as attractive. And there's not that distinction very often made in nurseries, and so you may expect to get one and you get the other. And so I don't want that to happen to people. So I don't tend to recommend it very much. But that is one that I would love to see in more yards. I have it in my front yard, and it kind of spills over the front of my front yard and kind of over onto the sidewalk.
You have the coastal variety.
I have the coastal variety, yeah, and I got that from the Watershed Nursery because they're really good about, they're good with their natives. They know what they're doing, and they're careful about what subspecies are what. So, yeah, Native Here Nursery is another one who, those are both East Bay nurseries, so that's kind of that's what I know. But the Marin CNPS folks may be able to help as well.
Good. So Faye, go ahead.
Hi, Andrea, great presentation. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the grazing programs that we've been seeing more commonly in Marin County, and to what extent there could be some unintended consequences for native plants in the open space areas, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, grazing is a tool, and like every other tool, it's only as good as its user, essentially. So, people with weed whips can go in and mow a native grass too low and damage it, or mow at the wrong time of year. And it's kind of similar with grazing. The thing that I don't very often see that I am worried about is that in drought years, the native plants are a little more susceptible from dying to being overgrazed. So there's not always that understanding or that fine touch from a grazer, particularly if they're talking about fire safety. And so there is that extra danger in a drought year like we're having right now. So those are kind of the unintended consequences. Another one that I've seen in other areas is if the animals are traveling from an area that has weeds to an area that doesn't have weeds, they can carry either in their fur, more often in their fur than in their feces, but they can carry weeds from one area to another. And so those are kind of my two main concerns. So I did some work when I was with the water district looking at, what's the overall cost of crews versus, I think it was mostly goats and sheep that I was looking at. How effective were they and how efficient were they for weed removal and for fuel reduction? And the crews are cheaper. They're not as cute. So maybe we need to get them bunny costumes when they're out working, but I wish it were more about like effectiveness monitoring than public perception, but I do often get the sense that it's a perception issue, and that the nice thing about the animals is that they're not as greenhouse gas producing. But if you have to, drive up and feed the livestock dog every day, you're still making that car trip or truck trip. So. those are my thoughts.
Good. Thank you so much. Good. Other questions for Andrea? Go ahead, Marty Nelson. Good.
I always kind of get hung up on the soil issue. I mean, I appreciate the regional approach to figuring out what grows, but I am really struggling with soil issues. And I'm just wondering, most of the time I hear you don't amend the soil for natives to grow natives, but what could I do to improve soil for natives?
Yeah, I think the selection of plants is going to be really important. So there are some plants that deal really well with kind of that. I have super heavy clay in my backyard, and I had a new garage built, and we kind of took up some concrete, and so basically it's subsoil, and I did nothing to it. I planted Danthonia californica, and I planted Stipa pulchra, and I spread some wildflower seed, and I said, have at it, kids. And the Stipa and the Danthonia are perfectly happy. They're used to that heavy clay soil. They're used to basically new ground. You know, the oaks, they're planted in an area that wasn't under concrete. And I didn't plant them. The Jays planted them. But they're doing really well. And then, my yarrow is struggling. My yarrow likes it a little, I would imagine it likes it a little more well-drained. So I'm very much I'm kind of like I said, I'm a lazy gardener. And so I plant the plants that I think are going to do well without any help. And I kind of go from there. So there's some great, you can choose on Cowscape if you have a particular type of soil and the drainage issues that you have, you can choose that in Cowscape in the advanced search. I've also found, Annie's Annual has their plants for clay recommendations. There are some natives on that. And then just, the time that I've spent in heavy clay grasslands, I know what I see around. And so, clovers and phacelias, clovers in particular will add nitrogen into the soil. The purple needle grass has really deep roots, and that'll help break it up. And so in a few years, I imagine I'll be able to plant some additional plants that maybe I couldn't at the outset. You can, if you want, add some kind of aged compost in to make your soil a little fluffier if the issue is kind of compaction. But really, I just plant plants that do well in that type of situation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right plant, right place, right? That's our line. Yeah. Any remaining lingering questions? That was a nice one to think about, because soil has come up as we are all focused on this issue. So we'll let that window close. We'll thank you for your time with us. I think we can all, yes, either this way or electronically. Yeah, you're so knowledgeable. I was happy, I think one of the times I was getting ready to contact you, and I was reminded, because you've shared some about what's available online from CNPS, but there are also some wonderful printed materials. We were talking earlier before folks arrived about the most recent issue, but it was this issue that if we look closely, we can see there you are inside the cover. So you're not, you're not the centerfold, but Flora, the most recent issue that just came this week, there's a wonderful story about the silver sword and the sort of research that's gone into finding that it originated from a California plant, possibly through a seed that was carried by a golden plover that made its way to Hawaii from California. And just a whole feature on seeds with wonderful pictures about how they get from place to place and grow. And you've certainly talked about the jays. When Faith was talking about having a problem with oaks, I have oaks that pop up in potted plants because probably that's the easiest soil, at least for the squirrels in my yard, to get into. So I'm growing some watercress in pots that I'm keeping nice and moist. And you know, dang if an oak didn't sprout up in one of my watercress pots. So if somebody's got a pot that has been planted with one, you might find a better candidate for transplanting. Yes. So thank you for being with us today.